Hello, everybody. That was kind of interesting, wasn't it, to see everybody chime in about who they were and where they were from and see the blue lines moving around. It was kind of neat. I have spent more than half of the 41 years I've worked as a forester as a manager. And so as a manager, I know that generally you have too much to do, too little time, not enough budget, not enough people, probably not the people with the expertise you need, and you probably don't have the equipment you need to really get the job done. I just wanted to put that out so that everyone understands where I'm coming from, and to also say that urban forestry is a social endeavor, as is actually all conservation. It really depends upon people valuing something and wanting something to happen. There has to be a will to get things done. Now, I can tell you on every social survey or every focus group that I conducted, the value of the urban forest for wildlife habitat always ranked up high. And that was always a difficult thing to deal with because so little was known about wildlife habitat, especially in urban areas. So here we are, you and I, in this new world and working on urban forestry. And I just wanted to take us through a little bit of a history because this history itself is important and it indicates what we have to deal with on the landscape. It's our history. So first, we notice in history the indication of trees and woodlands being inside cities, primarily during the Renaissance as private gardens, okay? And they had a spiritual context, like the Garden of Eden. But trees weren't on the streets in the Renaissance. Later on, we begin to see private parks, like in London when there were new building projects in the early 19th century. And later on, we began to see trees being used for accents for public rights-of-way. Some sophisticated arboriculture, like what Napoleon did in Paris. Through the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, this was strictly a tree-based perspective. As a matter of fact, in the United States, the planting of individual trees found its greatest expression beginning in the 19th century. The next phase that comes about has to do in the 19th century United States when we begin to see an emphasis on urban parks. And of course, Frederick Olmsted is recognized as a leader in this. What you're looking at on your screen is a modern day aerial image of Central Park and his design from 1858. It was a vision of large urban parks as institutions, primarily for experiencing the landscape, okay? Another innovation at the same time that comes out of Olmsted is the idea of parkways. Nice, smooth, undulating road systems, not too bumpy. Of course, he didn't have cars back then, but he was mostly thinking about carts and wagons. So, and another innovation actually is the creation of the park system, which we often see today ourselves, again, as we don't usually have in our cities or urban zones one park. We have a whole system of parks, and they can be used for various things, everything from soccer to baseball to playgrounds for neighborhood children to the bigger, larger parks like Central Park or something similar where we actually engage in the landscape itself. The entire design of parks, in fact, coming out of Olmsted's period, was focused on healing and the reduction of stress, the restorative process. Very similar to what we talk about today, actually, in terms of the urban forest. So city populations exploded in the United States in the 19th century. We had human health problems, epidemics like cholera, smallpox. These images are from the late 19th century in New York City. In the 1870s, a New York physician, Stephen Smith, spearheaded the movement to plant trees. He argued that they would save lives. Smith, who pioneered the city's sanitary reforms and founded the Metropolitan Board of Health, he correlated high ambient temperatures with childhood diseases from a number of infectious diseases that he studied. So here we have, at the same time that the engineering professions are mounting a masterful approach to water systems and wastewater systems and sanitary solid waste systems, the development of the sanitary city, we also have in there the planting of trees for health. So they're all happening at the same time. Again, very similar to what you and I often talk about today. Something new happened in around 1969, right around the time that Ian McHarg publishes his seminal book on an ecological approach to urban design and landscape architecture called Design with Nature. I think that's an important title, Design with Nature. This is basically a text for landscape architects and urban designers that demonstrates that we can actually design cities and other human-dominated landscapes to fit within the constraints of the natural environment in which they occur. So this is the very first time we're seeing this expressed openly and documented. And if you have never read this book or looked at this book, it's worthy of your attention. It is from 1969, but the narratives, the explanations are clear and concise, and they are every bit as relevant today as they were in 1969. And unfortunately, perhaps even more important to understand. In the late 1990s, the National Science Foundation Long-Term Ecological Research Program identifies 2 sites for the study of urban ecological systems, that is, human settlements. One of them in Baltimore and the other one in the central Arizona Phoenix area. This truly is the beginning of modern understanding of the integration of vegetation back into the sanitary city, designed primarily through the systems of civil engineering to deal with human health. So we can see this evolution beginning to occur, and of course we are living with these things right now. These are what we have inherited as urban managers and as researchers also. Interestingly enough, if you look at the image on your screen, this is of Baltimore, and you can see that in 200 years how big Baltimore has gotten. I want to say that 200 years is only about half the lifetime of a white oak that lives in that region. So from an ecological standpoint, these urban cities are growing very, very rapidly. And of course, the next thing that you and I have been introduced to, thanks to folks at EPA and folks like Dave Nowak, is we have begun to look at the ecological services provided by the urban forest. And of course, this has driven a lot of interest in the urban forest over these last 20 years and has heightened its level of prestige. What you're looking at on the screen is actually a study that my group, the Tampa Bay Watershed Forest Working Group, did with EPA, and we conducted this analysis in the city of Tampa, but in the entire urbanizing region of the Tampa Bay watershed. And the reason we did that was because we recognized that now, when we talk about urban forestry, it's no longer the city core. It's the entire region in which the culture and the values of the people are determining the distribution and the quality of the vegetation across landscapes much further away from the city than we had typically thought about in the past. So, where does this leave us? We know the current emphasis on urban forestry is kind of very popular right now, is a response to the emergence of population growth and the rapid expansion of cities into metropolitan regions. So where does our very young profession of urban forestry fit? And how are we going to respond to the challenges that society faces today? The context is unprecedented. So we can look back historically and see where we came from, and we may be able to pull some insights out of that. But today we are in uncharted territory. What we can use, though, is the ecological principles as a touchstone in guiding the development and implementation of a more comprehensive form of urban forestry. A contemporary approach to urban forest management is going to require that our focus shift from simply trees. It's going to shift to trees, woodlands, and forests within entire metropolitan ecosystems, within entire regions, within entire watersheds. As these urban areas expand, they are going to surround and bring into them entire forest patches. As a matter of fact, there's a group called Forests and Cities right now that is looking at how to manage forests within city environments. So this is all going to shift management focus from objects, from people thinking about trees and streets like the image on the right there as something, some object like a pipe or a curb, to something that is more living. It's going to shift management focus from objects to ecological processes, to relationships, and from a piecemeal, project by project look at how we do our job to a landscape approach, to a comprehensive systems approach to urban forestry. After all, that's what urban forestry is truly about, right? Taking a systems approach. And now urban forest management approaches, they'll include like passive types of management for unmanaged forest nature reserves, low levels of management and close to nature forestry, kind of mid-level, combined objective forestry, intensive short rotation forestry. It's happening right now in metropolitan regions. And of course, what we had typically up until very recently considered to be urban forestry, municipal and residential arboriculture. All of these things are going to occur at the same time within these metropolitan regions. These will become comprehensive and complex forms of management. So here we are, we've got too much to do, not enough money, not enough time, don't have the right expertise, and often we don't seem to have the will or the intent of the agencies that we work for. Well, here we are being asked to incorporate now conservation of wildlife. Let's take a look at this very quickly. According to a recent analysis, nearly 30% of all North American birds have disappeared in the last 50 years. Okay? In the last 50 years. New research published in the Journal of Science shows massive losses in the United States bird population and steep declines in almost every habitat. If you want to see this online, you can go to the North American Bird Conservation Initiative, and I've given the U.S. Forest Service some references that you can use and some links. Okay? So today, we're being asked to enter into a new phase of urban forestry. Not only are we being asked to think outside of the city and municipal limits, but we're beginning to be asked to look at an international geographic scale of conservation as we look at these migratory birds. one of the things that we need to understand about what we're going to get into, and I'm going to talk about this in just a second, is the more narrowly defined we are about how we describe habitat, the more likely you are to influence habitat use. Let me explain that to you right now. The question is, where do you work? I saw some of us work on the West Coast, some of us on the East Coast, some of us in the Southwest, some of us in the Great Central Valley of North America. These all are different biomes, and they all are composed of a great diversity of forest types. And we should never forget that in some places we live, they're not necessarily forest types. They have different types of habitat. But we're talking about urban forestry today. So for you and I as managers, we need to know where we work, what is the native forest habitat like? Can we describe it? Then we need to think about the vegetative palette that we can work with. I know that many of you right now are planting non-native trees because we're trying to fit these and pigeonhole them into the sanitary city of concrete and asphalt. It doesn't matter whether we plant native or non-native. Well, I think that question is answered when you think about that 96% of North American birds feed their young on insects, and that insects co-evolve with specific species of plants. And so the answer to that is yes, it does matter. Native is definitely much, much better than non-native, and sometimes non-native, I'm not talking about invasive, just non-native, provides very little in the way of habitat altogether. So what's special about what we're talking about today? What's the deal? Well, generally speaking, habitat, which rolls off the mouth of many of us, even second graders, is not very well understood or documented. And in the past, historically, scientists and practitioners have observed and documented habitat in places far away from human habitation, okay? And they have not looked at habitat within a human-dominated system. That's what's beginning to happen today. That's what you see in Wayne and Jerry show you. That's what Susanna Learman and her collaborators did when they worked on the models that are now incorporated into iTree for at least some of the birds in the eastern United States. We're beginning now to see scientists and practitioners, knowledgeable practitioners, begin to look and try to describe and quantify habitat within urban areas. This is extremely important. What you need to understand is that just because you have the habitat or that you go about creating the habitat according to these models does not mean that the birds are going to be there. What you also need to understand is the distribution of the birds down to the finest scale that you can get. I created models for 236 vertebrate species of animals for the U.S. Forest Service in the Mid-Atlantic. When I tested for it, the models worked great. I looked at the presence of the animal I was looking for in the habitat model I created, and 97% of the time they were there. But only about 60% of the habitats that I identified were actually occupied because we're still not being conscious of the fact that there are many social dynamics going on and that these animals distribute themselves in an uneven pattern, particularly in these urban areas where we have these really incredible shifting mosaics of land use. I want to talk just a moment about parks and street trees. We often think of street trees as not being good in terms of habitat, and perhaps they're not as good in terms of breeding habitat as some of our bigger parks, but they do serve an important function in providing areas for cover and also for feeding. And one of the things that I thought was very interesting in a study out of Los Angeles that came up was that in many of our disenfranchised neighborhoods where we don't have a lot of street trees, right, and we don't have backyards, we don't have very much in the way of birds. But if we can put back those street trees, they found out that the birds will use it. And so in these disenfranchised neighborhoods, we can bring back some of the wildlife. The street trees don't matter as much in single-family residence areas because so much of the vegetation is on private property behind or around homes. And we know that from iTree, right? You know, clearly 60% or more than the majority, that is, of the urban forest resides on these properties. So we have to think about the vegetation that's inherent in the habitat. Locally, we have to look at the role of population dynamics. Try to understand what birds are in your region. You can do that by looking at breeding bird surveys. You can do that by looking at different types of surveys that have been done by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. There are ways to do this through your extension office, through your land-grant university. There are ways to get at this information, and you need to have both the habitat description and an understanding of the distribution of the animals to create an efficient and effective urban habitat restoration program. Finally, we know that anything that you do is not simple in urban areas. And then again, there's a lot to it, right? There are many, many moving parts. I'm not going to get into all this, but again, I want to emphasize that it has to have the will of the people. The people have to be truly engaged. All of this is truly a social endeavor. And finally, I want to say that we have a significant role to play in sustainability of nature. You and I, as people who work in urban areas and urbanizing areas, particularly as this age of the Anthropocene begins to emerge. What we need to do now is to begin to actively participate in the science. You and I, as noted here, we are the owners of the data of iTree. Data is like gold to researchers. Find researchers who are interested in coming into your city because you have the data that they can begin to use to look at and understand and provide place-based models for you to use for your urban bird habitat work, okay? Think critically about what you read. Think critically about what you read. We need to do a much better job at monitoring our conservation actions, understanding what's working and what's not working. We need to be able to adapt to the changing mosaic of land uses and the expectations of our society. And we need to recognize we need to share what we know. This is not a one-way set up cooperative research, opportunity. We need to set up cooperative research with state wildlife investigators using our data. Invite them in. It is becoming more fashionable, and there are greater grants available for doing this type of research right now. Finally, I want to thank you. I want to thank you for what you do. I want to thank you for caring. There are not enough of us in this world. Thanks a bunch, folks. Bye-bye.